Welcome to the wonderful world of tea and stories. Today's story takes us on an adventure with betrayal, resilience, and a reversal that will leave the entire operating room silent. Pour yourself a cup and settle in. The first time my sister Sarah called me the dumb one, I was 10 years old. She was 12, and she had just won the school science fair with a project our mother helped her build. I had entered, too, a simple experiment about how plants grow toward light, and I'd gotten an honorable mention. Not enough. Never enough. At dinner that night, Sarah looked across the table at me, and with a smile so sweet it could rot teeth, she said, "Mom, Diana will never be a doctor like me. She's not smart enough. She's just Diana." And my mother laughed. My father told Sarah she was absolutely right. Nobody looked at me. Nobody said a word to defend me. I learned at 10 years old that in my family being the smart one meant being Sarah, and being Diana meant being an afterthought. But that was 20 years ago. Now I'm standing in a state-of-the-art pediatric cardiac surgery unit, looking at an angiogram of a 6-year-old girl's heart. Her aorta is twisted, her left ventricle failing. Without a surgery that only a handful of surgeons in the world can perform, she will die within a month. The girl's mother is frantic, her father weeping in the waiting room. Their family has exhausted every option, called every specialist, flown across the country, and every door has closed on them. Except mine. I am the last chance this child has. And the girl's mother, the woman who will soon walk through those double doors and see my face for the first time in 6 years, is my sister Sarah. I can already picture her face when she realizes. The room will go silent, that kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. But to understand how I went from being just Diana to being Dr. Diana Rhodes, the surgeon who holds my sister's entire world in my hands, I have to take you back to the beginning. Our family lived in a small town in Pennsylvania called Willow Grove, the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did. My father, Robert, was a pharmacist who owned the local drugstore, and my mother, Linda, was a part-time piano teacher who believed, with every fiber of her being, that children were born into roles and those roles could never change. In our house, Sarah was the star, brilliant, beautiful, sharp-tongued, and utterly certain of her own greatness. She announced at age 7 that she would be a cardiologist, and my parents built their entire identity around that promise. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one. The one who stayed up late with my father when his arthritis flared, massaging his hands without being asked. The one who held my mother's hair back when she was sick from chemo, an early-stage breast cancer caught in time, but terrifying. The one who always showed up. But showing up, I learned, counted for nothing next to being exceptional. I fell in love with medicine the summer I turned 14. I started volunteering at the Willow Grove Free Clinic, and within a month, I knew deep in my bones that this was where I belonged. Not in a lab coat issuing commands like Sarah dreamed of doing, but at the bedside, holding a hand. Explaining a diagnosis in language a scared person could understand. Spotting the small symptom that everyone else overlooked. I had a gift for noticing things, the faint yellowing of a patient's eyes, the slight irregularity of a pulse, the way a child's breathing changed when they were about to crash. The head nurse, a stern but kind woman named Mrs. Olson, took me under her wing. "You don't need a title to save a life, Diana," she told me one afternoon. "You need eyes, and you need to care." Those words became my compass. When I was accepted into the University of Pennsylvania's accelerated nursing program, I came home with the letter clutched to my chest like a winning lottery ticket. I expected, maybe not a party, maybe just a hug. Instead, my mother handed me a glass of water without looking at the letter and said, "Well, at least you'll have a job. Someone has to empty the bedpans." And Sarah leaned across the table, took the letter from my hands, read it, and laughed. "A nurse? Seriously, Diana? You're going to spend your life taking orders from people like me?" My father said nothing. He simply reached over and patted Sarah's hand. "She's always been the helper, hasn't she?" he said, as if describing a dog that could fetch. I didn't let their dismissal stop me. I threw myself into my studies with a hunger that surprised even me. Every class, every clinical rotation, every late-night study session, I poured everything I had into proving them wrong. But here's the thing. I wasn't trying to become a doctor. I wasn't trying to match Sarah. I was falling in love with nursing, the art of it, the science of it, the sacred intimacy of caring for someone at their most vulnerable. And the deeper I fell, the more I realized that my family would never understand. To them, there was only one kind of success, the kind with a white coat and a prescription pad. My family did not attend my nursing pinning ceremony. They said they couldn't afford the time away from Sarah's medical school orientation, which coincidentally was scheduled for the exact same weekend. I stood on that stage, reciting the Nightingale Pledge, and I told myself I didn't care. But my hands shook as I lit my candle. And when I looked out at the sea of families cheering for their graduates, I felt for the first time the full weight of being invisible. After graduation, I took a job at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, CHOP, on the pediatric cardiac floor. It was the hardest, most beautiful work I'd ever done. I worked 12-hour shifts, often staying late to sit with families waiting for news. I learned to read an EKG strip like a poem. I learned to catch a crashing child before the monitors even alarmed. I was good, really good, and the attending physicians began to notice. One of the senior cardiothoracic surgeons, Dr. Alan Pembroke, pulled me aside after a particularly harrowing code, a 3-year-old who had arrested on the table and whom I'd helped stabilize before the crash team even arrived. "Diana," he said, "you've got hands I'd trust in any operating room. If you ever want to go further, physician's assistant, even medical school, don't let anyone tell you you can't." I was glowing. I drove home that night replaying his words, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could be more than my family ever believed. I called my mother to share the news. She listened for perhaps 10 seconds before interrupting. "That's nice, honey. But listen, Sarah just got engaged to a thoracic surgeon at her hospital. A real catch. They're throwing an engagement party next month, and we need you to come. Don't wear scrubs." And just like that, the door slammed shut. Again. The engagement dinner was held at the Savoy, the fanciest restaurant in the county, 20-foot ceilings, chandeliers the size of small cars, waiters in white gloves. My parents had spared no expense. Sarah's fiancé, Dr. Kenneth Morrow, was a rising star in cardiothoracic surgery, and everyone kept saying what a perfect match they made, two brilliant doctors, destined for greatness. I wore a navy dress I'd found on clearance at Macy's. I'd curled my hair, put on mascara, tried to look like I belonged. My mother greeted me at the door with a hug that felt more like a pat down, checking for scrubs, I think. "You look presentable," she said. "Now please don't talk about work tonight. This is Sarah's evening." I swallowed the lump in my throat and said I understood. The toasts began. My father spoke first, a glowing tribute to Sarah, his brilliant daughter, his legacy in medicine who would carry his name forward. Then Kenneth's parents, then Kenneth himself, who talked about how he'd fallen in love with Sarah's sharp mind and sharper ambition. And then Sarah stood up. The room hushed. Sarah raised her glass and looked around the room, and then her eyes settled on me. Her smile didn't waver, but something in her gaze sharpened. "I want to thank everyone for coming," she began, "and I want to especially thank my little sister, Diana, for being here tonight." My heart lifted. Maybe this was the moment she would finally acknowledge me. "Diana," she continued, "is the perfect example of what happens when you're not quite smart enough to be a doctor." A few people laughed, nervous, uncertain laughter. My mother smiled into her wine glass. Sarah went on, her voice dripping with false affection. "She's just a nurse. Anyone can do that job. But Diana, she's happy taking orders from people like me. She's okay with being second best. And honestly, I admire that. It takes a special kind of person to accept their place." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I sat there, at that table full of my family and their friends, and I let her words wash over me like acid. "You're just a nurse, Diana. You always wanted what I have, but you'll never be good enough." That was the line, the one that would echo in my head for years, the one that would end up printed in hot pink on a YouTube thumbnail someday. After dinner, I excused myself and went to the bathroom to splash water on my face and try to stop my hands from shaking. I was leaning over the sink when the door swung open, and Kenneth's mother, a severe woman named Patricia Morrow, walked in. She looked me up and down with the same expression you'd give a stain on your carpet. "You're the sister, aren't you?" she said. "The nurse." I nodded. She sighed, pulling a lipstick from her purse. "Between you and me, Diana, you should be grateful Sarah even invited you. A girl like you, with your lack of credentials, could embarrass a family like ours. My son is marrying up, you understand. Don't weigh them down." And she walked out, leaving me gripping the cold edge of the sink, staring at my own reflection. I went home that night and didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and replayed every word, but I told myself I could still survive this. I could still go to work and do what I loved and build a life that mattered even if my family never saw it. What I didn't know was that Sarah wasn't finished with me, not even close. 3 days after the engagement dinner, I received an email from the hospital administration. When I walked into that meeting, I found the head of HR, my supervising physician, and a representative from the state nursing board sitting at a long table. In front of them was a file with my name on it. Sarah had filed a formal complaint. She claimed I had overstepped my scope of practice on a patient she'd consulted on, a claim she backed up with falsified notes and a manufactured incident report. Her story was simple and devastating. I had attempted to perform a procedure I wasn't qualified for, endangering a patient's life, and she, the vigilant doctor, had caught me. None of it was true, but my family's name carried weight in that town, and my sister's word carried all the weight in the room. The hospital, to protect itself, suspended me pending investigation. The nursing board opened a case. Within a week, my reputation in the city I'd given everything to was in shreds. I called my parents, desperate for anyone to believe me. My mother's response was immediate and final. "I've spoken to your sister. She's not lying. You've always been jealous of her, Diana. We're done. Don't call again." And she hung up. I packed my apartment in 3 hours. I drove west with no plan, no job, and a stethoscope in the passenger seat as the last proof that any of it had been real. Behind me, my sister was celebrating her engagement, my parents were celebrating her, and I was just a nurse who had tried to be something she wasn't. Or so they believed. I ended up in a city I'd never visited before, Cleveland. It was cheap, and far enough from Philadelphia that no one would know my name. For the first 3 months, I lived in a rented room above a laundromat, the smell of cheap detergent and static clinging to everything I owned. I worked double shifts at a nursing home, doing the kind of care no one celebrates: bathing, feeding, turning bedbound patients to prevent bed sores. I was invisible, and for a while that felt like safety. But even at my lowest, I couldn't stop being the person I was. I noticed the medications the residents were on. I questioned orders that didn't make sense. I caught a drug interaction that would have killed a man if I hadn't spoken up, and the visiting physician who'd prescribed it, a young resident who was embarrassed to be corrected by a nursing home aide, grilled me about my training. I told him the truth. I'd been a pediatric cardiac nurse at CHOP. He stared at me for a long moment. "Then what the hell are you doing here?" he asked. His name was Dr. Walsh, and he didn't just ask questions, he listened. When I told him what had happened, not the whole sordid family story, but the professional destruction, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I've seen nurses with your kind of intuition before. They don't belong in nursing homes. They belong in operating rooms. If you ever want to fight back, I can help." He slid his card across the table. "Think about medical school. Think about become a surgeon. You've already got the hands. You just need the degree." I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my sagging bed and stared at that card until the ink blurred. Sarah's voice was still in my head. "You're just a nurse, you'll never be good enough." But another voice was there too, Mrs. Olson's. "You don't need a title to save a life." And for the first time, I realized those two voices didn't have to cancel each other out. I could fight for a title, not to prove Sarah wrong, but to prove that my hands were worth the training. I applied to a post-baccalaureate pre-med program at Case Western Reserve University. I used my savings and took out loans that made my stomach clench. For 2 years, I lived like a ghost, studying during the day, working night shifts at the nursing home, sleeping 4 hours a night. I lost weight. I lost touch with everyone I'd ever known, but I gained something too: knowledge, confidence, a burning certainty that I could do this. Medical school was harder than I could have imagined, but it was also home. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who didn't care who my sister was or what my parents thought. They only cared about what I could do, and I could do a lot. My clinical rotations were the same story I'd lived in nursing. The attendings began to notice my hands, my eyes, my almost preternatural calm in crisis. I wasn't just a good student, I was a natural. By my 3rd year, I decided on pediatric cardiac surgery, a specialty so demanding that most residents burned out before they finished. But I had something they didn't have: years of bedside experience. I'd held crashing babies before the monitors screamed. I'd talked families through impossible choices. I entered the operating room not as a novice, but as someone who already belonged there. During my fellowship, I began working on a research project that would define my career. I was studying a rare congenital heart defect called 𝗕𝙪𝙧𝙨𝙬 with pulmonary atresia, a condition so severe that most children didn't survive past infancy. The existing surgical repair had a high failure rate, and I, nursing background and all, had an idea for a modification that might improve outcomes. I worked nights, weekends, holidays. I built 3D models of infant hearts. I practiced the technique on simulators until my hands moved without thought. And one afternoon, standing over a small patient who would have died without intervention, I performed the repair and it worked. The child's oxygen saturation stabilized. The heart beat, strong and steady. I had just created a procedure that would be written up in journals, debated at conferences, and taught to residents for a generation. But all I could think in that moment was, this is what my hands were always meant to do. Within 5 years of finishing my fellowship, I was one of the most sought-after pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country. The Cleveland Clinic had given me my own surgical unit. I'd published 18 peer-reviewed papers. I'd trained 40 other surgeons, and not once had any member of my family called to congratulate me. They didn't even know my new last name. I'd changed it after the suspension. In the eyes of the world, Diana the failure didn't exist anymore. There was only Dr. Diana Rhodes. I poured my earnings into a trust for families who couldn't afford pediatric surgery, and I established a scholarship for nursing students at Penn, quietly, without my name on anything. I didn't need recognition anymore. I'd learned that the deepest validation comes from the work itself, not from the people who should have given it. 6 years to the day after I'd packed my apartment and driven west on a crisp October morning, my desk phone rang. The caller ID showed an area code I recognized: 215, Philadelphia. I almost didn't answer, but something in my gut told me to pick up. The voice on the other end was one I hadn't heard in 6 years, my sister Sarah's. She was crying, her words tumbling over themselves. Her daughter, Emily, my niece, born 2 years after I'd disappeared, had been diagnosed with a severe form of the very heart defect I'd spent my career treating. 𝗕𝙪𝙧𝙨𝙬 with pulmonary atresia, complicated by a corkscrew-shaped pulmonary artery that made the standard repair impossible. "Diana," she sobbed, "we've seen every specialist on the East Coast. They all say the same thing. There's only one surgeon in the country who can do this, a Dr. Rhodes in Cleveland. But I can't get through to her office. They say she's booked for months. Emily doesn't have months." I let her cry for a long moment. Then I said, very quietly, "Sarah, do you know who Dr. Rhodes is?" There was a pause. "No," she said, "but if you still know anyone in medicine, maybe you can help us get an appointment. Please, Diana. I know we've had our issues, but this is my daughter. My daughter. My daughter." The words rang in my head like a bell. I told Sarah to come to Cleveland. I told her I could get her in to see Dr. Rhodes personally. She was so desperate she didn't question it. She just booked the next flight. The next morning, I stood in my office and looked at the family photo the hospital had taken of me for the Meet Our Team brochure. I'd never shown it to anyone from my past, and now I was about to walk into a room where my sister, my mother, my father, and Kenneth would see it for the first time. I chose my scrubs carefully teal, the same color I'd worn at CHOP, the same color I'd been wearing when they destroyed me. I put on my white coat. I clipped my ID badge, Diana Rhodes, MD Fax, Director of Pediatric Cardiac Surgery, to my lapel, and I walked down the hallway toward the consultation room, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The door swung open. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that sucks the air out of your lungs. Sarah saw me first. Her face turned the color of old milk white, almost gray. Her hands flew to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "No." Kenneth, who'd never met me but had heard all the stories, looked confused for a moment before the name on my badge registered. Then his face went slack. My mother, Linda, stood up so fast her chair tipped over backward, and my father, who had called me a helper like it was an insult, stared at me like he was seeing a ghost. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I walked to the head of the table, pulled out the chair, and sat down. I opened Emily's file, which I'd already reviewed hours before, while Sarah was still in the air, and I spread the angiogram films across the table in front of me. "Your daughter," I said, "has a corkscrew pulmonary artery secondary to tetralogy of Fallot with pulmonary atresia. The standard Rastelli repair will not work. The modified unifocalization approach pioneered by Stanford has a failure rate of 40% in cases like hers. But I have developed a technique, a pericardial roll technique, that has achieved a 92% success rate in 23 cases over the past 4 years. I am the only surgeon in the country who performs it." Sarah was crying now, not the elegant tears of a woman who'd been wronged, but raw, ugly sobs. "Diana," she choked, "please. She's just a little girl. She's my little girl." I let the silence stretch. I remembered every word she'd ever said to me, every dismissal, every laugh, every lie that had shattered my career and my life. And I said the words I'd been waiting 6 years to say. "When you told that room full of people that I was just a nurse, that anyone could do my job, did you ever imagine," I said, and I leaned forward just slightly, "that your daughter's life would depend on my hands?" My mother finally found her voice. It came out as a croak. "Diana, we didn't know. We didn't know you'd become this." I turned my head to look at her. "No," I said, "you didn't, because you never asked, you never called, you never once, not once, believed I could be anything more than the words Sarah put in your mouth." Kenneth spoke next, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Rhodes, I've read your papers. I've watched your grand rounds. You're one of the best in the world." He looked at Sarah, and something in his expression shifted, a cold, dawning realization. "You told me your sister was a burnout, a liability. You told me she nearly killed a patient." "That was a lie," I said, and my voice didn't waver. "She ruined my career with a false complaint, and every single person in this room believed her, because it was easier to believe I was a failure than to admit I might be better than her." After the meeting, I didn't let them linger in guilt. There was a child who needed me. I walked into the operating room, and the team, my team, had already prepped. The anesthesiologist, the perfusionist, the scrub nurses, every one of them looked at me with the kind of trust that takes years to earn. I scrubbed in, and as I pulled on my gloves, I closed my eyes for a single second. I thought of Mrs. Olson. I thought of Dr. Walsh. I thought of every patient I'd ever lost, and every patient I'd ever saved. And then I opened my eyes, and I said, "Let's begin." The surgery took 7 hours. I dissected, reconstructed, rerouted. I used the pericardial roll technique I had invented, the one that would one day be renamed the Rhodes Procedure, to create a new pulmonary artery from the tissue around Emily's own heart. My hands never trembled. Not once. When I finally closed the chest and the bypass machine was turned off, the room held its breath. And then, the heart monitor beeped. Strong, regular, perfect. The little girl who would have died within a month had a new heart, not a transplant, but a rebuilt one, and I had built it. 7 hours later, I walked into the waiting room. I didn't need a nurse to deliver the news. I wanted to see their faces myself. Sarah, Kenneth, my mother, my father, all 4 of them rose to their feet the moment I appeared. There was terror in their eyes and hope, and something else I hadn't expected, shame. "Emily is stable," I said. "The repair was successful. She will need monitoring for several weeks, but I expect a full recovery. She will run, she will dance, she will grow up." Sarah collapsed, not into my arms, not yet, but into the chair behind her, sobbing with a relief so profound it shook her whole body. "Diana," Sarah said, her voice ragged, "I'm so sorry. I was jealous. You were always the one who actually cared, who was good with people. I was scared you'd be better than me, so I destroyed you. I destroyed you, and you still saved my daughter's life. How can I ever?" I raised my hand. She stopped. "I didn't save Emily because of you," I said. "I saved her because that is what I do. I'm a surgeon, a very good one. And a very good surgeon doesn't let a child die because her mother was cruel." I paused. "But I also won't pretend the past 6 years didn't happen. You took my career. You took my family. You took years of my life. I built it all back on my own without any of you, and I will not apologize for my success. I will not downplay it to make you comfortable. I am Dr. Diana Rhodes. That is who I am now, and who I am now does not need your approval." In the days after the surgery, my family tried, awkwardly, desperately, to rebuild what they'd broken. My mother cornered me in the hospital garden, twisting a tissue in her hands, and said, "Your father and I want to make this right. We want to be in your life, Diana. Please let us try." I looked at her, this woman who had laughed when I was told I wasn't smart enough to be a doctor, and I said, "I don't know if I can trust you again, but I'm willing to find out, slowly, with boundaries, and with the understanding that I will never ever be invisible again." As for Sarah, I let her visit Emily whenever she was in the hospital. I was professional, kind, and distant. She wrote me a letter, a long, handwritten letter, detailing every lie, every cruelty, every moment of jealousy that had driven her to destroy me. I read it once. I put it in a drawer. I haven't decided yet whether to forgive her fully. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not a requirement, it's a choice, and for the first time in my life, that choice belongs entirely to me. People ask me now, after everything, if I'm happy, if proving them wrong made the pain worth it, and the truth is, no, it didn't. The pain wasn't worth it. The pain was cruel and unnecessary, and it left scars I will carry forever. But the person I became in spite of that pain, she was worth it. She is worth it. I learned something essential during those years in the wilderness. Your family can refuse to see you, but that doesn't make you invisible. The world is full of people who will recognize your worth if you just have the courage to walk away from the ones who don't. My hands built this life, these hands that Sarah called just a nurse's hands, these hands that held a dying child's heart and made it whole. These hands that will never ever be underestimated again. If anyone has ever made you feel like you don't matter, like your years of quiet, faithful work add up to nothing, I want you to remember this. You were never the one who was small. You don't have to change who you are. You just have to refuse to shrink for anyone else. One day, the people who looked right through you will need you, and by then, you won't need them to see you. You'll already know exactly who you are. And that is the best revenge of all.